My falling moon is real, Paul whispered. He took a trembling breath. It moves. It moves. Men always fear things which move by themselves, the Ghola said. You fear your own powers. Things fall into your head from nowhere. Then they fall out. Where do they go? You comfort me with thorns, Paul said. Hello, hello. It is I, Damien, aka Sleepy Book Reader, and this is my final Rocket Summer video. This is the fourth video in the Rocket Summer sequence as designed by the great Michael K. Vaughan. I was supposed to do this fourth week in the last week of July, but here I am in, I think, the last week of August. So I'm a slowpoke. I started late and I've continued to be slow with lots of family vacations in and out. But so for this assignment, we were supposed to read books or science fiction from the 30s and earlier for week one. Week two was the 1940s, science fiction in the 1940s. And week three was the science fiction in the 1950s. And now week four, the 1960s, which Michael considers a cutoff point. I'm not sure where a good cutoff point might be, really, but I have, in my reading, brought in kind of feelings I already had about the history of science fiction, but it reinforced them, I guess, of how much science fiction builds on itself over time. And the ultimate book of the 1960s is Dune, and I did start listening to the audiobook with my daughter when we were on a road trip a few weeks ago, and I've read it many times. She was not keen on it with all the, as she called it, info dumps at the beginning of the book. In any case, I decided to read the other Dune book that came out in the 1960s because I had some interesting memories of it, Dune Messiah. And so I consider Dune like the book of the 1960s, but also it's one of those pivot points, in my opinion, in science fiction. It it took all that came before and it synthesized it together in a new way. Most obviously stuff like Asimov's Foundation series and stuff, but really all kinds of science fiction ideas, synthesized it into a new kind of book and turned, added quite a bit to it, especially tonally and the meaning of it all, perhaps, and gave science fiction a new starting point in a weird way. And Dune Messiah was its kind of uh, negative mirror image sequel. So the first time I read it when I was a kid after reading Dune, I was horribly disappointed. And some people consider it one of the least good Dune books. I consider it one of the best, actually. Um, the other thing I read, I guess, before I jump ahead, was I read just a single story by Roger Zelazny, a novella called A Rose for Ecclesiastes, which was in the only story from the 1960s in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And it's been reprinted in many, many ways, in many collections. It's here in this Four for Tomorrow by Roger Zelazny. Maybe it made it best of the years of its time. It's been in all kinds of collections, things about Mars, what have you. It's here in this collection of Roger Zelazny's stories called Threshold. It's all over the place. And it's interesting because Roger Zelazny's, one of his early novels, which either goes by the name This Immortal or And Call Me Conrad, tied with Dune for the Hugo Award that year. Uh, so anyway, these two figures were major people in the 60s. Frank Herbert and Dune went on to total immortality. Roger Zelazny is more just remembered for his fantasy series Amber, which is really great, but it's more of at this point, kind of a cult book. I think it would be. Uh, there's like one way to get it now in the Great Book of Amber, I believe. Anyway, that's all an aside, but these two authors seem like a good way for me to take in the 60s a little bit. And when I started Dune Messiah, I was like, oh no, am I remembering wrong? Maybe this isn't such a great book. But as I progressed through it, I really came to love it all over again. And I saw somewhere where Frank Herbert referred to the first three books, Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune, as if they were like a piece of music. And so the Dune Messiah is like the somber middle piece, and it also is kind of the keystone, I think, of what's really going on in all the Dune books. Statistics. At a conservative estimate, I've killed 61 billion, sterilized 90 planets, completely demoralized 500 others. I've wiped out the followers of 40 religions which had existed since. Unbelievers, Korba protested. Unbelievers all. No, Paul said. Believers. My liege makes a joke, Korba said, voice trembling. The jihad has brought 10,000 worlds into the shining light of... Into the darkness, Paul said. We'll be 100 generations recovering from Maudib's jihad. I find it hard to imagine that anyone will ever surpass this. And in it, we have our hero who conquered all in the first book, now this emperor slash messiah leading an empire based on a religious crusade that has conquered tens of thousands of planets within a 12-year period. My one complaint about the book really is that everything is supposed to have happened within a 12-year period between the end of Dune to Dune Messiah. So he's maybe in his early 30s at that point. Um, but he is weighted down with the horror. For those who haven't read Dune, I won't give everything away, but he has this kind of almost magical, although it's supposed to be a genetic thing, sense of prescience about the future. And that's what makes, amongst other things, makes him able to defeat all his enemies. Um, but he is actually weighed down by the future and the way it controls him and all his behaviors. And there's reference to another thing about the book is it's brilliantly written, I think, although it took me a while to come to that idea. But there's a vagueness, and maybe it's a necessary vagueness, in what Paul Atreides, the hero, Maudib, the emperor, is afraid of in the future, that he has to do all these horrors in the present to avoid a much worse future. But we're never told what that might be. And I think that continues as a theme in Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune too. And I can't remember if things swerve off in the last two books of the 6-book series. But the whole idea that there's this kind of, I think might just be in Children of Dune or God Emperor of Dune, they start calling it the golden path, the one way through history that will help humanity in the long run, I guess, which is kind of like the foundation path, the path the foundation's trying to steer humanity in so that the dark ages won't last as long. But much of the novel is done in conversations or interior monologues, interior thoughts of characters. And at first that seemed really bad to me, but every conversation is actually a little battle between two different sides, and the thought monologues become like music, this kind of prose poetry. And I wouldn't always be on the side of prose poetry, but something that is really effective in my mind. And and it seems, looking at the 60s, uh, there's all this use of kind of drug trips to see the future, and there's all this sort of philosophizing that could be taken as kind of new age philosophy and stuff. You can see the 60s growing up through the Dune books into what they became in the 70s too, all of these kind of ideas. But Yeah. So I really enjoyed it a lot. And then looking at and I think Dune came out, is it 1965? And then Dune Messiah, which I just read, came out in 1969. Meanwhile, in what year? 1963, I think, or 64, Roger Zelazny's The Rose for Ecclesiastes came out, 1963, I think, in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. Uh, in here, there's an introduction by Theodore Sturgeon, and he says, "A Rose for Ecclesiastes is one of the most important stories I have ever read. Perhaps I should say it is one of the most memorable experiences I have ever had. It happens that this particular fable, with all its truly astonishing twists and turns, up to and most painfully including its wrenching denouement, is an agonizing analogy of my own experience. This astronomically unlikely happenstance may well make it what it is to me, and may not reach you as poignantly. If it does, it will chop you up into dog meat. But as objective as I can be, which isn't very, I still feel safe in stating that it is one of the most beautifully written, skillfully composed, and passionately expressed works of art to appear anywhere." And I don't feel it. And I've read, because it is a really famous thing of his, and I am a Roger Zelazny fan. I've read it numerous times during my 40 or 50 years, at least 50, of reading science fiction. And I never saw, it's the one that made the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. Apparently it was number 6 in the voting. And it's the story that made the inner circle of science fiction in the early 1960s fall in love with Roger Zelazny and made him their hero. And then he built on it with lots of other good stories. Let me see. In here, there's some more stuff about it. In Robert Silverberg's introduction, let's see if I can find it. Um, let's see. And then, in case anyone still had not noticed, he published what would become his first classic story, A Rose for Ecclesiastes, in the November 1963 issue of the magazine of science fiction, fantasy and science fiction. No one failed to notice that one. It was nominated for the Hugo Award. The Nebula Award had yet to come into existence. Judith Merrill picked it for her year's best science fiction collection, and it was chosen a few years later as one of the 26 greatest stories included in the first volume of the Definitive Science Fiction Writers of America anthology, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. It's the only representative of recent science fiction in a book that was heavily weighted towards the classics of the 30s and 40s, and included no other story published after 1956. It has been reprinted countless times ever since. After A Rose for Ecclesiastes, it was impossible to ignore his presence among us. And then, let's see, they have notes about, in this book, it's kind of a more scholarly book, I guess. They have notes, a word from Roger Zelazny, and notes that go on for quite a while about all the meaning of the Rose for Ecclesiastes. Um, And Roger Zelazny wrote of it, "I had a strong sentimental attachment to what is now called space opera. I had long wanted to do something of that sort. When I began selling fiction in the 60s, it was too late, almost. The space program had already invalidated the Mars and Venus of Edgar Rice Burroughs, almost. If I wanted to do homage, I would have to act quickly and do my best. I knew that I would only be allowed one shot at each world, and then I would have to leave the solar system. A rose for Ecclesiastes was my only word on Mars. The doors of his face, the lamps of his mouth, all that I would have to say on Venus. So I did it. I wrote them both and got in under the wire." Um, they quote a letter. Usually he wouldn't say that. So in The Rose for Ecclesiastes, the hero is the greatest poet of his day named Gallinger. And he was a child genius, and he's a accomplished super linguist. And, at an early age, wrote these poems that have become taught alongside Yeats and others in colleges during his lifetime. and now he is sent to Mars to help translate Martian poetry or Martian legends or Martian version of the Bible, because the Martian Bible turns out to be similar to Ecclesiastes in our Bible, our Christian Bible. Um, so he usually wouldn't talk about the character, but someone wrote him a letter and he answered, "You ask me why I hated Gallinger in A Rose for Ecclesiastes. The answer is that I hated him because he was me. Once in my lifetime I let a beautiful thing die, and now it can never be. Details are not important in that they would add nothing. The story says what it must and stands or falls on its own merits. But you're right in your observation that it's a sad story, despite the fact that you felt crushed and even cheated. Life is full of these things, and one of them motivated this tale. I didn't want to end it that way, but it had to, because he was me. I felt pain along with him. He was a better linguist than I, and a better poet. He was a very good, misunderstood man." Anyway, um, Zelazny was a poet, and I think when he was in college, he wanted to be a poet, but then he decided to write science fiction because he had dreams of making a living as a writer, which he achieved. Um, but in Rose for Ecclesiastes, this poet comes to Mars and eventually learns that the Martian people are dying, that they can't reproduce anymore. They have very long lives, but other than that, I guess they're fairly human, because he falls in love with and um, does what humans who fall in love do with this Martian dancer. And okay, here I'm going to spoil it. And so you might want to skip ahead a little bit if you don't want a spoiler. He gets her pregnant, and he, um, they are going to, I assume, kill the baby, or perhaps kill her, because they believe their species should die. But he breaks into their religious conference and reads them from Ecclesiastes and then argues against it, because it's kind of at least as presented in this book, a notion that you can't change anything and you have to just accept things. And so his passionate plea to them to let their race survive, either by reproducing with humans from Earth or by using Earth's medical science to help them reproduce. Uh, and okay, super spoiler. At the end, he finds out that he had been prophesized, and that they were waiting to see if this prophesized person would come and convince them to let their race continue. And so he succeeded, the prophecy succeeded, but it's revealed to him that the woman was assigned by prophecy to mate with him, and she did not love him. And so the story ends in heartbreak. But the language within the way the story is written was very unconvincing to me. I didn't really believe in this character. Um, and the way it was, I think the way it was written, in many ways, even though this is kind of a launching pad almost for the modern late 60s science fiction and the early 70s, the new wave science fiction. I think Roger Zelazny was a hero to that. There's something kind of old fashioned about it. And instead of the guy being like a scientist or a rocket pilot, he's a poet, but he's still kind of like the superhero poet. And so it's very, and you can hear from Roger Zelazny's comments, he was trying to go for an old feel. I think the reason the writers of the time and critics of the time loved this story so much was it was a turning point for old-fashioned science fiction meeting this more literary science fiction that was starting to happen. And by literally making the hero a literary hero, um, that was very powerful to all the writers and other people in the sort of inner world of science fiction. And why, for instance, Theodore Sturgeon feels it's about him. Plus, like most of us, Theodore Sturgeon must have had some painful heartbreaks. But I was completely unaffected. It seems completely a piece of its time, whereas Dune and Dune Messiah seem to transcend time. I mean, they really are a thing of their time, but they're so much richer and more complex. And although they're kind of odd novels, they don't fit what you normally would call good writing or whatever in the sense of plot and pace and everything. They go off in weird directions. Um, they they are sort of sui generis, if that's the right word, of Frank Herbert. They are really Frank Herbert books. I mean, they're so Frank Herberty. He just has his own special voice, and I think that voice is richer and more complex, even though it's a simpler story and a more dour story. Um, it's kind of heartbreaking on a much larger level than A Rose for Ecclesiastes, which is a set in a sense. Well, it's a tribute to this ancient Martian race kind of story, and then it's a story about one man's small heartbreak. I know these heartbreaks don't feel small when they happen to you, but most people have them and get over them and move on and find someone else to love and all of that. Um, but the embodying the tragedies of history and the call of the spiritual in Frank Herbert's Dune, the call and the horror of the spiritual, I think, in Frank Herbert's Dune, it makes it very transcendent, and his ability to write about those things. But still, yeah, there's that core of vagueness there, which perhaps, is a problem with new age kind of philosophy, or maybe a lot of philosophy in general. I was never a philosophy major. I took one philosophy class in college, and I remember thinking, this is frustrating stuff. But Frank Herbert makes it into kind of a musical poetry almost in his writing. So I am super glad I did this. I drew a lot of assumptions about different decades, and I may make a kind of wrap up video where I ponder what I think I learned from all the trying to look at these decades each separately, even though just reading a little bit in each. You, it's pretty easy to find a few major pieces from the 1930s or the 1920s in science fiction. In America, we're talking American science fiction. And then still pretty easy, although there's a lot more good stuff to read from the 1940s or important stuff to the development of the genre. And in the 1950s, it really starts to spread out. And by the 1960s, I think we're getting kind of an explosion. But in the middle of that explosion of science, novels and still the magazines running strongly, and things happening on TV like Star Trek and Lost in Space and other things, and movies like 2001. So science fiction's really starting to really spread out. And then on top of that, we get the bomb of the book Dune, which just grew and grew in popularity throughout the decade, and continued to grow in popularity ever since. So so science fiction is very different and much harder to grasp, I think, by the time you get to the 1960s. But each decade becomes a little more of a complicated thing. Where it is now, I have no idea. I read a lot of science fiction through, I don't know, I want to say like 2002, 2003. Um, and then things happened in my life. I was very busy, and then my daughter was born late in my life. And now when I try looking at newer science fiction, it's harder for me to get excited. But that ought to be a video for another video. Thanks for hanging in there with me if you have. And I hope the last few days or weeks of summer are treating you well. Frustration tangled him. He felt the pressure of mass unconscious, that burgeoning sweep of humankind across his universe. They rushed upon him with a force like a gigantic tidal bore, He sensed the vast migrations at work in human affairs, eddies, currents, gene flows. No dams of abstinence, no seizures of impotence, nor maledictions could stop it. Muad'Dib's jihad was less than an eye blink in this larger movement. The Bene Gesserit swimming in this tide, that corporate entity trading in genes, was trapped in the torrent, as was he. Visions of a falling moon might be measured against other legends, other visions in the universe where even the seemingly eternal stars waned, flickered, died. What mattered a single moon in such a universe?